So I'd like to call to order the Special Board of Education meeting on November 9th, 2020. It is currently 6:02 p.m. As permitted by Governor Pritzker's Executive Orders 2020-07 and 2020-33, the Oak Park and River Forest High School Board of Education in Cook County, Illinois will convene a remote special board meeting on November 9th, 2020. Board members, citizens, and staff may participate in the meeting by submitting public comment as indicated on our website. The state of Illinois continues to operate under disaster declaration related to the COVID-19 worldwide pandemic. The health department continues to advise the community to practice social distancing, wear face masks, and avoid unnecessary contact with others. Based on the current public health concerns, I, Sarah Spivey, as head of the public body, do not believe it is either practical or prudent to hold an in-person meeting of the Board of Education on November 9th, 2020. I further believe that it's neither practical nor prudent for the public to be present at the public body's regular meeting place. We will continue to hold a remote meeting with updated practices to comply with Public Act 101-640 that was signed by Governor Pritzker on June 12th, 2020. Pursuant to Public Act 101-640, since the meeting cannot be conducted at the regular physical location due to the health crisis, alternative arrangements have been made to allow any interested member of the public to hear all discussion, testimony, and roll call votes via both a link on our website as well as our YouTube channel. Gail, do we have any public, oh, I'm sorry, if we could take attendance, please.
Yes. Mr. Kofsky.
Here.
Dr. Moore.
Here.
Mr. Barron.
Here.
Mr. Isley.
Yep.
Mr. Martiri.
Here.
Ms. Harris. And Dr. I'm sorry, Ms. Dixon Spivey.
Yeah, not a doctor, I'm here. Okay, Gail, do we have any public comment?
No, we don't.
All right. Okay, so we are here this evening to have a conversation about race as a board, and I'm very happy to do so. And I would like to introduce our facilitator, Ms. Graham Washington. How are you?
I'm doing very well. Thank you so much
to
for
see you.
having me. Good to see you too. And thank you for making the time for this conversation tonight.
I'm gonna, Dr. Ammons has a couple of words she wants to say about you as well.
Okay, thank you.
Sure, yeah, thank you. So like Sarah just mentioned, and good evening, everyone. I am very excited that we have this opportunity to have a conversation about race, especially as we think about our leadership roles here in the district, as well for a community that espouses racial equity as a value. So, you know, again, excited to have Rashida Graham Washington here tonight to facilitate this conversation, in particular about, you know, race, racism, how it manifests, you know, in our everyday lives, and just kind of, you know, taking a look at ourselves and looking at how it impacts students, faculty, staff, and our just a larger community. So again, Rashida Graham Washington, I've known her ever since I've landed here in Oak Park and River Forest, and she's done some great work not only with 297, but also I'm having an opportunity to work with her with the Oak Park Public Library and the anti-racism advisory committee that I'm on there. So very excited to have her here in the space tonight, and I won't take up too much time, and I'll turn it over to Rashida now.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ammons. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm super excited for the work we're doing together, but also for the synergies that you have spoken about already between the organizations that RGW is working with. It's really an exciting time to be coming alongside Oak Park. And we have 2 hours. And if you've ever worked with me before, you know I'm going to take every single second. Having been a high school teacher myself, I'm accustomed to teaching bell to bell. So here we go. So I just want to do a quick overview. I'm sure you've seen the agenda, but we're going to start with a song by Gregory Porter called Painted on Canvas. And then we're going to talk a little bit about the conditions and context in which we learn, which is valuable to the equity journey, but also as leaders of schools. This is the water we swim in. We're going to do a little bit of narrative sharing and DEI work, developing the context and conditions for shared language, and then a little bit of time for Q&A, as we will have embarked on a lot of what our firm, RGW, refers to as the stage 0 work. We are firm believers at RGW. Our methodology is such that we can't just wake up one morning, get together, even if we've been working with a group of people or as a group of people around particular topics, and then just decide, and now we're going to start talking about race, jump right into that conversation with all of our context and all of our schema about what that means, and just presume that that will all just be fine and go into the deep and difficult waters of race in America. And so tonight really is about some tone setting and some norming for this group, as I suspect that even beyond the work we do together, this will be a pretty solid foundation for whatever ways you hope to embark on the conversation beyond tonight. And so let us listen to a song by Gregory Porter called Painted on Canvas. I'm gonna play the song and you'll be able to hear it. And as I play the song, I want you to be present to what resonates with you. I want you to be present to the messaging of the song, but specifically to be present to the song as you think about how its messaging might inform the journey we're about to take together. How does what we're about to do, how might it be best supported by the messaging of the song we're sharing together? So I'm going to turn it on now. Here we go.
That's a Chromebook with built-in virus protection, so you can click with confidence. With no more of this, and a lot more peace of mind.
Hold on.
Move along, viruses. Switch to built-in virus protection. Switch to Chromebook.
1 second, 3 seconds. Commercial.
Did you know they're called vacation days because
Here we go.
We are like children, we're painted on canvases, picking up shades as we go. We start off with gesso, brushed on by people we know. Watch your technique as you go. Step back and admire my view. Can I use the colors I choose? Do I have some say what you use? Can I get some greens and some blues? We're made by the pigment of paint that is put upon. Our stories are told by others. Like Motley and Bearden, these masters of peace and light, layers of color and time. Step back and admire my view. Can I use the colors I choose? Do I have some say what you use? Can I get some green with my blue? We're just like children, we're painted on canvases. We are like children, we're painted on canvases, picking up shades as we go. We start off with gesso, brushed on by people we know. Watch your technique as you go. Step back and admire my view. Can I use the color that you use? Do I have some say what you do? Can I get some greens and some blues? We're made by the pigment of paint that is put upon our stories are told by our views. Like Motley and Maiden, these masters of peace and life, layers of color and time. Step back and admire my view. Can I use the color that you use? Do I have some say? What do you use? Can I get some green and some blue? We're just like children. Oh, we're just like children. We're just like children, we're painted on canvases. Admire my view. Admire my view. We're just like children, like children, like children, like children, like children.
All right. For all the introverted and or internal processors, we're going to take just 2 minutes to be quiet and collect our thoughts about the question of what this song has to do with how we should proceed with our work tonight. And if you feel so inclined, well, let's just be still for 2 minutes and collect our thoughts. You can take notes if you want. I'm going to set a timer, and in 2 minutes, we will process both the song and your reflections. 2 minutes. All right. Let's turn to the chat box, and in it, if you would click on panelists and attendees and share in the chat box what resonated with you from the song that might be relevant and pertinent to us. Well, I'll tell you what, let's do it this way. I want your voices in the space. So if you could share out loud with the group, I will write into the chat box as I hear your reflections. And we can just popcorn this. So anyone who wants to speak can.
So Ms. Graham Washington, per the Open Meetings Act, we really can't use the chat because that doesn't get preserved.
Oh,
Unless Gail, is
Have
that
not used the
accurate?
chat before.
Yeah,
That's not something that we.
yeah,
Okay.
I'm sorry.
No, it's okay. It's quite all right. This is fine.
We can record though, right?
Mhm.
To capture it. Because when we're recording this,
Yes, we are recording it.
So
And I'm also
that will
taking
capture it.
minutes.
yeah.
So what I want you to do is just out loud share with me. And it is being recorded, so it'll be in the recording. And then I was gonna just document it so that we could refer back to it if we needed to during the session. Is that okay?
That is fine.
Yeah, thank you.
No problem. All right,
I'm ready.
do it. Who is that?
I'm usually kind of like a leadoff guy. So, you know, I heard, you know, we start with a blank slate, a blank canvas, and we pick up shades as we go based on the environment we're in, the people we know. So we're heavily influenced by those that we've been with as we kind of paint our canvas.
Thank you, Tom.
I'll go next, if that's
Yep.
okay.
Yes.
I want to pick up where Tom left off, that we are a canvas, and our lived experiences frame who we are, what we are, and how we are perceived by others, and oftentimes how we perceive others. And so while we may look similar on the outside, our lived experience truly determines the multitude of colors that make up who we are.
Mhm. Other thoughts?
I'll go next.
Okay, Gina.
Good evening, everyone.
Good evening.
Hey, Gina.
I actually, yes, everything that was shared, I kind of picked it up a different way. There's a line that he said something about, can I choose my own colors? That was what stuck out for me, was can I choose my own colors? Like, other people are painting on me, whatever colors that they think of who I am. And what I heard was, can I choose my own colors? That stood out for me.
And I'll piggyback off of what Gina said. That's what I heard too, that we can't always choose how others are perceiving us. We can request it. Like you said, can I get some green with my blue, I think. We can want to be perceived a certain way, but that doesn't necessarily mean that that's going to actually be how others perceive us.
Yeah, there's a, on one hand, when I was first listening to it, I was thinking that this is a song about kind of just simply building yourself up as you go, right? The layers that kind of go on you from your experiences. And then as it was going on, I wrote down this line, and so I don't know if I got this quote right, okay? But there's a line, I think, something about, can you use the colors I choose?
Can I say what colors? Can I say what, do I have some say what you use?
Do I have some say what you?
Can I use the colors I choose? Can I say what you use? I'm typing it in now.
Yeah, so there's this idea that kind of how you are defining yourself is not something that is just simply you, right? There's the idea that it's happening kind of through other people, and even the choices that other have are influenced by the choices you make and vice versa. That's a powerful idea.
So the "do I have some say what you use" line, I think is actually self-reflecting. I mean, you've got this opinion of me based on what I look like, where I've grown up, et cetera. Can I alter that opinion by being myself and giving you some input on who I really am? That's how I heard that, which I thought was an interesting line in the song. I also, I completely agree with what both Tom and Dr. Pruitt-Adams said at the beginning. I think that's was a powerful start, but I do think this was one where the whoever wrote the song, I don't know if the singer wrote it. Sometimes people cover other people's music, so he may not have written it. But whoever wrote this song was trying to see if they could have a little input on how they are perceived, irrespective of their background and what they look like.
Thank you, Rob.
And I don't know if it builds on this or not, but the author uses children a lot in this conversation, and I think it's used to indicate that, we're exploring in this process like children, not that we're managing it.
Yeah.
And I wanted to add to that, to Rashida, we're all like children. We're painted on canvases, just the whole idea of, I have this little plate that has the quote on it, "Home is where your story begins." And it feels like that is that's the start, but then you go out in the world and you are perceived differently by different folks. And, there may be false narratives of what people want to put on you, but that all of us have that experience. We're all, painted on canvases. So we, as much as we're different, we're all having that experience. It's just the differences of how we perceive ourselves and how others are perceiving us.
And I would add the thing that I got mostly was the repetition of "we're just like children." And so what I thought about with that was that children are impressionable, seeking guidance, have a lot to learn. We often don't know what we don't know, and that permeating all of it is to handle one another with care.
And what would happen tonight if these words that are now in the chat, so you can refer back to them as we go through our time together, what if these became our norms? What if this was just the conditions that were right tonight and all the time for embarking on these somewhat challenging and tenacious conversations? What if we expected repetition so that we didn't take on the posture of, are you seriously making this mistake again? I have to tell you this again. We've been over this before. And what if we understood the need to be created and impacted and influenced and designed by one another in the journey? And what if we made ourselves open to that possibility of that? Andy Warhol, I'm sure so many of you know who Andy Warhol is. Andy Warhol is a very famous painter who is world renowned in his work. And so is Basquiat, by the way. And at one point, people thought it was a good idea for Basquiat and Andy Warhol to co-collaborate in a design of paint, to create a series of paintings together. And I smiled just thinking about what that must have sounded like to each of their ears. If you know their work, you'll know why that sounds like a very interesting pairing. Initially, Andy Warhol was actually very excited to do it, and Basquiat was the one who was reserved and a little nervous about it. He's a very free artist, and he uses everything as a medium. And Warhol was much more concise and precise in his work. And they finally agreed to work together. And when they did, Andy Warhol being Andy Warhol, he made the first marks on the very initial canvas that they collaborated with. And he was very excited about what he had produced. He felt quite pleased with it. And Basquiat looked at it for a moment and then went to the canvas and painted all over the top of what Warhol had put on the canvas. Initially, Warhol was not, well, let's just say he wasn't excited about the idea of that. But as Basquiat continued to paint, and then Warhol began, at first contemptuously, to paint over what Basquiat had painted over, they developed a rhythm for trusting each other's coverage of the canvas, and produced a wonderful series of timeless work together, because they were willing to engage in the co-creation of overlap. They recognize that sometimes art intersects art, and that you often come out with a different, even better product when you are willing to embrace the layers. What if our work was about embracing the layers? There will be layers to the work we do tonight and beyond tonight. And it will be hard. We will be both, at some points we will be Warhol, at other points we will be Basquiat. And I imagine that the practice is what will lead to our comfort in trusting the layers. This is what I invite us into tonight and every night that you embark upon this topic of diversity, equity, and inclusion. It is not a matter of if as much as it is a matter of when. We will see the canvas a very particular way. And we will need to have that perception, that vision informed by other ways of seeing it. And when that creates the tension and the challenge and the anxiety that is often associated with such a process, we now have something to refer back to. Can I have some say what you use? Can I get some greens and some blues? We are, after all, like children, and we're picking up shades as we go. And so we take this journey with that in mind and allow that to serve as the norms by which we will embark on the journey together. So let's shift gears to talk about the conditions and context in which we learn. So I want you to get some learning, something that you learned in your mind. It can be practical or tangible, like learning how to type using a QWERTY keyboard, or learning how to ride a bike without training wheels. It can also be something like, my mom taught me that I would always get my allowance, I would get $1, and I would hold it so tight in my hand that it would leave marks by my fingers inside my palm. I would hold it so tight. And my mom would say, well, the good news is it's not gonna get out. But the other news is nothing is gonna get in either. So sit with that. And so I learned something about holding things tightly, that nothing will get out, but nothing will get in, right? It could be a lesson like that. That lesson is 40 years old, and I have sometimes lost sight of it, but never forgotten it. So you can get any one of those kinds of things in your mind right now that is more than 5 years old, which means that it is sustaining and enduring and it is lasting, right? Get that in your mind. Once you have that in your mind, as important as that lesson is to your life, that is not the thing we're going to work with tonight. So now that you have it in your head, in your mind, I want you now to think about the conditions that were happening around you, in you, with other people. What was the environmental context? What was your head space? What was your heart space? What was going on in your life when you learned this valuable, enduring, timeless, sustainable lesson? And I want you to write those conditions in the chat box.
The board
Just
can't
checking
write-
in. Are we okay with that, Gail?
The board should not write in the chat box.
That can't work. Okay. Oh, I just love FOIA. It's just
Sorry.
great. Freedom of information. We got it. Okay. Then you're going to yell it out to me, and I'm going to write in the chat box, which means it's recorded and recorded.
It'll be in the minutes too.
Okay. So just shout out popcorn style. What were some of the conditions in which you learned this valuable, sustainable, enduring lesson? And I will write them in the chat box.
And you said it has to be something over 5 years, right?
Mm-hmm.
By conditions, I just want to clarify one point on this. You're talking about like kind of the context of who we were in the moment we were in, right?
Yes.
I was frustrated and I wanted desperately to quit. That's my context.
Not your current job, of course.
No, this is not. It's 5 years or
Right.
further back.
Yeah.
And it was way further back.
More.
Yeah.
Okay. I don't know the right answer and I can't control my environment.
Yep.
Insecurity and uncertainty.
Frustration with a lack of progress and a desire to lash out strongly.
I shouldn't laugh.
Impatience and a bit of arrogance.
Mm-hmm.
Young and unguarded.
Mm-hmm.
I think Jackie and I shared the same moment. I want to go back to hers.
I'll jump in. A desire for improved relationships, generally speaking, like all relationships.
Difficulty and perseverance.
Who was that, please?
It was Roxana.
Thank you.
I was trying to learn some
Halima,
factual.
can you say yours? We're not supposed to.
Oh, I'm sorry.
write in the chat box.
The board members. I'm sorry. Go ahead, board member Spivey. I can go after you.
No, go ahead.
I would just say that stand in your truth so that progress can truly be made.
And mine was going to be that I was trying to learn something, but I learned that, but I ended up learning a lot more sort of about myself than I did about the topic that I was actually trying to learn about, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
Could I add one more?
Mm-hmm.
Please, transformative.
Mm-hmm.
I would say shyness and vulnerable.
Mm-hmm.
Mine is actually a deeper understanding to know more. Just scratching the surface.
All right, so let's take a look. Frustration with a desire to quit. I don't know the right answer and I can't control my environment. Insecurity, uncertainty, a desire to lash out strongly, impatience, arrogance, youthfulness, unguardedness, a desire for improved relationships, difficulty with perseverance, standing in truth so that progress can truly be made, trying to learn a thing, learning that thing, but learning more about myself than I did about the thing, transformative, shyness, and vulnerability. Okay, awesome. Now, what are the conditions in which we typically desire to learn? What do we name as the good and right conditions for learning?
I believe some of what we heard people say was a condition. A willingness, I think I heard a willingness to learn, to know more, learning more about ourselves, relationships play a key role in learning. I'm not sure about the arrogance part, but feeling capable. And I don't know if that translates to arrogance, but just feeling capable and that you can.
Awesome. What are some of the other things that we actually name as conditions when we talk about a learning environment? What do we want to feel? What do we want to experience?
Safety.
Here we go.
Feeling supported.
Safety, supported.
Stability.
I'm sorry.
Stability.
Stability.
Excitement and trust.
Roxana, what was the word before trust?
Excitement.
Excitement. Trust.
Comfort and affirmation in the setting.
Affirmation.
I would say inspiration and yeah, inspiration.
All right. So the chat box is there and everyone can look and see what is there. How would you relate the conditions that you named that were part of your actual experience in relationship to the conditions that we typically name outside of an experience when we talk about the conditions we want to learn in? How do you compare or relate those two lists?
I'm not clear on the question.
Yes. So as you look at the list we made based on things we actually learned that were enduring and sustaining, long-lasting lessons, as you look at those words that I put in the chat, and you compare those words to the ones that you listed for how you want to learn, what do you see? What are the distinctives between them?
Well, I would have said that for me, the conditions that we named are not the conditions that I learned my most important lessons in.
Kind of opposites.
They are very much opposites. And when we talk about learning, oftentimes when we're talking about it in a vacuum, we name the ideal. Wouldn't it be nice if we could learn our most enduring lessons in self-discovery and willingness and relationships and capability and safety and supportive environments that are stable and exciting and trustworthy and comfortable and all full of affirmation and inspiration? Ideally, if I could choose between the first list you made and the second list you made, who wouldn't choose the second list? Everyone would choose the second list. But this is ideal. And the list you made was from actual learning that really did happen. So these are the actual conditions in which you really do learn. And these would be really, really nice, but you didn't name any of them when you made your actual list for how you learn. What are we gonna do with this? And what does this mean for our time together? And what does it mean for District 200? And what does it mean for our community? What does it mean for our students? When we've named this ideal environment that did not turn up as one that existed for any of us when we named our actual learning environment. What are your thoughts about that?
One thought I have is that it's, you know, the fact that you asked us to go back in time, and I went to a young part of myself, and the thing that I take from that is that learning has happened since then, and what some of those lessons had the effect of you learn about ways you want to do things by how you were raised or experiences, and what you don't want to continue. And I think that in an opportunity like this, the aspirational is something that the fact that all of us brought those things up, to me, is a sign that it's more than aspirational, it's that evolution of ourselves.
Mm-hmm. That when you're younger, when you're 5 and you start kindergarten, you don't know a list to make, right? You're just kind of going to school, and whatever school is going to be is what it is. And over time, as we hone our desires, especially as learners, we begin to build a list, curate our elements that we desire for learning. Here is the challenge. I am not sure that that makes the conditions for learning change at all. We just want what we want, but the conditions for learning are often still what they are.
Unless you work at it, and it's hard, but it's work.
It is.
Yeah.
Other comments? Yes.
Oh, I guess, and I think it's unfair a little bit, because there were things I learned in very positive environments too, but maybe not. But I learned you had to learn in all environments.
Sure.
Right. I mean, you didn't really get to choose. If you were going to learn, you had to learn in all environments.
But Craig, you're making exactly the point that we have to learn in all environments, and we won't always get to choose. So what would it look like for our first list to meet our second list? That sounds like greens and blues, right? And that oftentimes it is more of a melding of these things. As Dr. Moore has named, we have more control over how we learn now than we did when we were 5. And my hope is that that will serve as an enhancement to the experience. And we also know from the first list we made that these other components do exist as a part of the journey. So we don't have to be binary in our thinking about either of them. But what we can do is widen our expectation in a way that says all of this is a part of the learning environment. And maybe I'm only in trouble if I anticipate and expect one or the other. But if there is room for us to hold it all in the learning environment, then I'm not caught off guard by having a good time while talking about equity and diversity and inclusion. And I'm also not caught off guard by being challenged in my thoughts and ideas, because I had a wide and broad expectation that all of that could happen at the table.
Yeah, one thing I want to share is something that I've strived for over time, and I've picked it up along the way and fail at it, but it's to learn from criticism. And when being attacked, and when maybe 90% of it is unmerited, what is it? What's the kernel of some truth or a lesson in it that I can glean? So it's not throw the cliched baby out with the bathwater. And so I think that's hugely important for anyone, but especially for public officials who are often hearing more from the critics than the folks praising us.
Thank you for that, Matt.
Matt, people praise us. Could you give them my email? That'd be
It's only
awesome.
it's only off the record when they do it though, so you never see it.
Usually the first sentence in the email.
So one that, when you asked about, when you talked about the condition we learn from and the condition we hope for, and you asked how will that handle or resonate with what the work we're going to do with you. So we came into this meeting to talk about race, to learn about race. And so when I think about the music up front, I took that back to race. But when we talk about learning, and almost all of us talked about the challenges, and there was something that caused us to have to learn. It wasn't like, hey, give it to me. That's what talking about race is about. That it's going to be difficult. It's going to be hard. But if we, as I look at the people in this room, if we are a collective of administration and board, we have to be ready to have some of these conversations together so that we can learn together in order to move forward together, and knowing that it won't be easy. It won't be that wonderful way in which we all hoped we would learn, but that at the end of the day, we walk away better than we were when we started.
Thank you. What I am hopefully leaning us into is a space that doesn't have to be a space that is non-binary, that it's not a this or a that it's not a blank canvas or a full canvas, that it's not a challenging way to learn or a beautiful, safe way to learn, that when we start to talk about race, that it won't be yes or no, or left or right, or black or white, but that in all of this is layers of color and time, right? And that when we can get curious about the layers and the colors over time, that we get to see how we relate to race as a collective differently.
Like I just said I like that.
Yeah, we get to see it emerge differently over time. Okay. I'm going to launch us in, well, any final thoughts on that piece before we go to the next part? Okay. So the next thing we're going to do is talk a little bit about race. We've been kind of walking around the pond, and we looked at the pond and we kind of assessed the state of the pond. Now we're going to dip our toe in the water a little bit. This exercise was originally one that Beverly Tatum espoused to. Anybody familiar with the work of Beverly Tatum? While all the Black kids sitting together in the cafeteria. And Beverly Tatum often speaks about the importance of sharing your race narrative and the way that it informs your identity, because it helps you to get to know something about yourself that you may have become out of touch with. But as you share that in a community or in an organization, it also helps you to get in touch with each other differently on the topic. Finally, it gives us a practice that we don't come already ready, already equipped to have, which is talking about race interpersonally and intersectionally. This is something I think we sometimes assume we have the skill set to do, and then we walk away from the meeting sort of scratching our head like, what just happened in there? And it's because of the way that we jump right into the middle of the pond, and we don't get acquainted as a collective with the pond and gradually immerse ourselves. This exercise helps us to gradually become immersed. And so I'm gonna give you about 10 minutes to go someplace in your story. You can go as far back as you want. If that sounds too frustrating, you can stop at wherever you come to, wherever bubbles up or resonates for you. Somewhere in your story where you recall first or one of the first experiences in your life where you knew racism was at play. Whether or not you knew to call it that, because sometimes there is just a knowing without words, right? Like something is not right about this. And it's not until later that you're like, that was racism, right? Or that was injustice. So I want you to go back to one of those occurrences in your life, and you can make bullet points. You can start to write a narrative. I'm going to give you 10 minutes to go and become reacquainted with that experience. You can get the content of the story, but also don't forget to register any epiphany that you had and how it made you feel. Any epiphany you had and how it made you feel, as well as, recounting the occurrence as well. I'm going to give you 10 minutes to be with that, and then we'll come back together and share some of our findings. 10 minutes. Everyone could take this final minute to wrap up whatever thoughts you're having. And before we embark on sharing some of these narratives, I'm gonna flip the agenda a little bit and talk a little bit about a context and conditions for shared language, because I think that is actually a little bit more, it will inform our narrative sharing a little better. Because when you share narrative, you use words. And when you use words, you use them the way that you intend to use them. What you use them from the context out of which they mean something to you. And that's informed by your learning, that's informed by your context, your environment, your experiences, and all of that. And so you don't all define terms the same way as a result, because we've all had different experiences, because we've all had different connections, because we come from different environments, and language is informed by all of that, then even when we're using the same language, we don't always mean the same things. And so as we're about to start sharing narrative, people are going to use words and they're going to use them in the ways that are most central and most appropriate to them, which might be different than the way we understand certain terms. Oftentimes in EDI work, the way that we respond to that situation or circumstance is we get a list of terms and then we define those terms together. The consultant or whoever the workshop facilitator is will give those to you. You receive them, and much like the way we've sort of been conditioned to learn, we accept what the piece of paper is in front of us. But the reality is that that doesn't necessarily change the way I relate to that term. So, for example, in my work, I might use the word white supremacist all the time. In fact, in my work, I see the word and use the word at least on a weekly basis. But if I were to sit down with my grandmother to have a conversation about diversity, equity, inclusion, racism, civil rights, injustice, any of that, and I went to use that word, it would shut the conversation down completely. And the reason why I would shut down the conversation with my grandmother is that she can't have a conversation in which that word is being used. It is too traumatic an experience for her. So if I am interested in actually having the conversation with her, and I'm more interested in that than I am in the terminology I get to choose, that I will choose words that forward our discussion because I'm most interested, and I legitimately am most interested in what my grandmother has to say about the civil rights movement of her day. So when we have conversations, she might use words and I use them differently because I do the work I do. And what I have to do oftentimes is ask her, what do you mean when you say those words? Giving us a glossary of terms would not help us in this situation because it's not a technical problem. It's an adaptive challenge. Adaptive meaning that the issue is underneath what is on the table or at the surface. And while there is a place for shared glossary of terms, What maybe builds the better foundation for having conversations like this is first just understanding that we will always use words differently because our language will always be informed by our experiences, and our experiences are different. And the only way we really get to have a shared and common language is to know more about each other's experiences so that we can better understand what each other means when we use particular words. What Karen means when she says injustice or when she says feminist is very different than what I might mean when I use those same words. But I can say to Karen, when you say feminist, what does that imply? And then I get excited because I get to get curious about her answer. And I really do want to know, by the way, so we should figure that out at some point. But that's where the real hard work happens that's necessary to better engage these conversations. Not by me giving you a glossary of terms that includes my definition of injustice, my definition of feminism, and telling you these are the terms, and now you must embody them in the way that I'm sharing with you as the principal consultant. And so as we hear our stories tonight, if you hear words or even experiences that make you more curious about the person who is sharing the story, I would encourage you and invite you to make the time to get curious with that person about their story so that you can authentically share a language and not just have a glossary of terms that we agree to. That will come down the line. Any questions about that? All right, friends, then let us have some narrative sharing. The sort of protocol or process for this is that you're simply going to share the story that you just sat with for 10 minutes. You're going to tell a little bit about your story, its impact and significance in your life, and how it made you feel. The rest of us are going to listen actively and maybe even take some time at the end to get curious with you about your story and to share impressions that come as a result. Who wants to start?
I'm going to selfishly jump right in there.
Get in there.
I'm going to get in there. I think the one thing that I sat with, what that kind of came to mind for me was as growing up in a very, I would say, hardworking, blue collar to middle class community in Minneapolis. Majority of the businesses, if not all of the businesses, were all Black owned. Our community health care clinic was Black owned. Our grocery store was Black owned. And I grew up in a very large, multi-family Southern household with many generations in that household. And my aunt and my uncles were artists. And lucky for me, I grew up in an area where a lot of people don't know this. Prince's mom and Prince grew up 3 blocks away from my grandmother. I would walk down the street and I would see members of the time, Sheila E., Jimmy Jam and Terry Lewis all the time in my neighborhood. It was a very artist-rich community. And both my aunts and my uncles went to high school with Prince at North High School. They were painters and extraordinary artists. And I can remember one day being at home with my cousins and my aunt, one of my aunts, who was one of Prince's classmates, came in and was extremely emotionally distraught. And she did a painting and she told my grandmother, I overheard them talking about the painting she did for one of her art classes was presented to the rest of the class and the rest of the school community for a contest. But unfortunately, hers was not selected to be presented at the larger school community contest because of what the art teacher thought was not art. And she asked I heard her telling my grandmother the assignment was for them to paint art as they know it in the community that they're from. Well, also in our community that was 95, 96% Black, you had a lot of different people who didn't share, you know, the life that you lived, that did different things at night than you did at night with your family, but there was no judgment. We were all still a community. So she painted a woman and a man in 70s clothing, very well, you know, very well groomed, beautiful, immaculately dressed, in a community with a very, I would say, you could tell it was a very Black background. So there was nothing but Black people in the community in the background. The woman and the man, you could tell were in a couple. But to the art teacher, I could overhear my aunt telling the art teacher that she painted art as she knew it in her community. Well, the art teacher told her, you painted a pimp and his whore. You didn't paint art in a community. And she was extremely distraught, and she never painted anymore after that. So the only thing that I can remember is my grandmother and my grandfather going to the high school and having a meeting with the teacher and the principal and what they were talking about and what they didn't consider art. And she said, my daughter painted art in our community. And this is what we see in our community. We see a man walking down the street with a woman that he's in a relationship with. We see, you know, other people on the block that are just walking past, that are dancing or playing music, which was every day in my neighborhood. And she painted what she sees every day. And you told her she painted a pimp and a whore. How could you do that to somebody that's pretty much a young lady who's growing up in a very rich Black community that she knows everybody? She painted two people she sees every day. And you told her that that wasn't art. And to me, that was my first impression, my first experience with racism, because our neighborhood was very Black. So I didn't know anything beyond, I didn't see my first non-Black classmate until I actually went to middle school. So for me to see that happen, and for me to see a person who was as talented as my aunt, I mean, extraordinary artist, to not paint for years after that by what one teacher told her who was not Black, was just devastating. And I just didn't really even know how to understand it until later, as I grew up and went to college and reflected back on that experience, and the fact that she didn't even start painting again until I was graduating from college when she painted again. So the impact on her emotionally and mentally, you can tell, just was ravishing. So I think that was my very first experience with oppressive mindsets, and what that can do to a student and what that means for an educational institution.
Thank you so much, Shalima. Wow, you did get us started indeed. Thank you.
Thank you.
Any impressions that you would like to share?
The thing that comes to my mind is there's a great book that Marlo Thomas was the editor of, called The Right Words at the Right Time. And I read it 15, 20 years ago, and there's been at least one sequel, but it's all these well-known people. And Muhammad Ali in the book talks about a teacher in Louisville when he was there in high school, who kept saying to him, you're going to amount to nothing. You're not going to go anywhere with this boxing. And it really fueled him to greatness. It was part of what he used to become great. And, but other people, right, that would not be their reaction. It would cause them to go the other way. And so it's really dangerous. But there's more than a few stories in that book about people being negatively motivated. And it's, in my view, so unnecessary and so damaging. And I think most of us could agree on that. So anyway, that's a book that I find really inspiring, because it's about so many of these moments of truth. So I just thought I'd share that with, it just came to mind as Shalima was sharing that.
I'll go next. Oh, I'm sorry, go ahead, Jackie.
I just had a quick question, Shalima. How old were you at the time?
At the time, I was 7 or 8.
Thank you. Just trying to get that context. Thanks.
So some of my team have heard this story that I'm going to tell. My mother raised me deliberately to be a Black female in a white world. But when I went to school, I went to elementary was all Black, high school was all Black, college was all Black. And so my first experience, even my first teaching assignment was in the Black neighborhood. And so when I got hired to go to another district because of the work that I was known to do, first I was told I was a quota, and they were hiring me because they had to have a quota. And when I walked into the building the first day, the principal asked me why was I there, that the teacher assistants were to show up the next day. I said, I am the teacher. I was then sent to my classroom down in the basement, back in the back. And I sat there all day waiting for the OT, the PT, the speech people to come down and talk to me about the IEPs for my students. When that didn't happen, at the end of the day, when we had the staff meeting, I went upstairs and I said, I've looked at the IEPs for the students in my classroom, yet no one came down to talk about their IEP, to talk about their OT or PT and their speech and language. And the therapist told me that they were waiting for the teacher to arrive. And once again, I had to say, I am the teacher. That entire summer, because I went to them in the summer, the only 2 people that spoke to me in that building were the 2 assistants who were assigned to my classroom. And that's when I knew that all the things that my mom had said to me growing up, that I was born with 2 strikes, I was Black and I was female. That's the first time it just really hit home that people couldn't see past the color of my skin to realize that I could be a teacher. Even my doctor, when she filled out the physical form, filled out the side for the bus driver and not for the teacher.
I'll go. It's hard to follow stories like that when, of course, as a white woman.
Karen,
white...
hold on 1 second.
Mm-hmm.
Dr. Pruitt Adams, Karen, hang on just 1 second for me.
Yeah.
Are you done or are you taking a moment?
I had, in my lifetime, there's been so many stories, but that, you asked for the first, I had heard, but that was my first experience. But in my 65 years, I have a box full.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I want to, as the facilitator of this space, I want to name the weight and I want to name the gift. I want to name the weight and I want to name the gift. So I'm going to state what sometimes feels like the obvious, but isn't always obvious. Some of us have to go far and deep to pull these stories out of our places. And that is the weight of it. I did this same workshop earlier today with the executive leadership team for the library. And as I was joining, 1 minute before time for us to start, I knew exactly why. I was like, I'm waiting to the last 60 seconds because there's the wait. And I was like, Rashida, do not ever schedule this to do it twice on the same day ever again. Especially in this context, like right now, you want to do this twice in the same day in this national landscape that we are experiencing? Not the best idea. There is the weight, but our narratives are the most valuable thing we hold. So when we come together to share them in this way, it is a precious gift. And so I just want us, as we are taking this journey, to understand that we are holding two things that feel very contrary to one another. And that's what you're feeling in the space. You're feeling the greens and the blues. And so I want us to be present to that reality as we forge ahead, because this is the humanity behind all the policies and the protocols and the procedures and the governance and the budgets and the calculations and the quantifiables. This is the humanity behind that. And that is a weight and a gift. Karen.
It's hard to follow that because mine doesn't carry that kind of weight. And I appreciate the sharing that Shalima and Dr. Pruitt-Adams have done. I think for me, when I really thought hard about the first thing I could remember, you know, I grew up in the white suburbs of Cincinnati. And what I remember is one of my grandparents commenting on that a Black family had moved into our neighborhood, and did they keep up their property? And I remember thinking the question was jarring, like, why specifically was she asking that question? But I also think I knew, I mean, I was probably 7 or so, on some gut level, that the question she was asking aligned with the images that I saw in the media, on TV and in the movies. And you know, you had said we may remember these experiences and not quite recognize it as racism at that age. But that was the first experience that I thought of.
Can I ask Karen a question? Did your grandmother, I just want to make sure I understood, the Black family moved on your street or your grandmother's street?
On our street. I lived in a predominantly white neighborhood.
And so I'm just curious, and don't take this the wrong way. Did your grandparents encourage your parents to move?
Well, no, my parents had already been part of white flight. Yeah, we had left a neighborhood that was changing and moved into this neighborhood when I was in first grade.
Karen, what do you recall feeling about it? Do you remember having any feeling at that time, or did it grow into a feeling over time? How did that go?
You know, I guess I don't recall a lot about it, but like I said, what I remember feeling is that it aligned with the images that I had of Black families, you know, on TV, living in projects or in not, you know, rundown neighborhoods or whatever. So I think that that's what I recognize, that is how Black people have been portrayed in my world. You know, that that makes sense why she would ask that. You know, and it just went on from there where I grew up.
And you said you were 7?
Yeah, I think that's about, young.
Any other questions or comments for Karen?
I guess, one thing that comes to my mind is when I hear stories like that about anyone or my own family history, for me, sometimes the tension is how I might have judgment for a lack of response or a lack of pushback on something like that. And then the choice becomes, then there's a whole host of choices from there, right? Grace, mercy, judgment, condemnation. And so that's something that is a daily battle. If I'm riding my bike today and I have a mask on or I don't, right? Like all these things that we can judge each other about and versus giving potential grace. So.
Thank you for naming that, Matt, because, I guess I'll go ahead and call myself middle-aged at this point. And it's a tricky place to be because in my 20s, I didn't yet have kids old enough to hold me accountable to anything. And that was more fun because then I could just hold my mom accountable for all the things. And there was no one saying much of anything back to me. This is not as easy because that same why didn't you and why did you and why did you allow and why didn't you just not and why didn't you fight for? But the fight maybe just looked different than my lens could hold or see, right? And I wanted all this accountability from a generation who had their own way of doing it. And now my girls are 30, 20, and 10. And they have a lot of why didn't you questions as well for themselves. But why didn't you just say, or why didn't you, or why are you still participating in this? That was this weekend. How could you be excited about this, right? And when you're in that middle space, it certainly makes more room for the grace and the mercy that you're talking about. And you start to have a better understanding for why maybe somebody wanted to and didn't, or maybe sometimes they did and sometimes they didn't, right? And I just think that is a probably better posture for considering this work together because it pushes us into a deeper level of curiosity and humility. For every time we're like, why didn't you just, which makes it sound like an easy thing, whatever's gonna come after it. We could think of all the times we simply should have just, and we didn't ourselves. Thank you. Next story.
I'll jump in.
Go for it, Tom.
Okay, so a little bit of a backdrop. My story is actually when I was 22. So I just want to give a little backdrop and then my story. I grew up in a predominantly white world, and I had friends of different races growing up. I had friends in college, but in those contexts, it would have been the minority, a long minority. So fast forward, I moved to Chicago, and being naive and curious in the city, I actually, a friend of a friend and I got together and we wanted to learn about the city. And so we did two things. We went to two places. One was Gospel Fest in the down at the South Shore Country Club area. And the other one was a festival in Humboldt Park. And we did this unbeknownst to what we were doing. We just, it sounded like good music. and we went. And I can vividly remember in Gospel Fest being one of probably a handful of white people in a sea of blacks, and talking to people and hearing, you know, their curiosity of why would I be there? Why would I come out and be there? Like it had never occurred to me that, you know, to be the standout, that you couldn't go someplace because you were of a different skin color. And it just hadn't been in my path. And yet here I was with the shoe on the other foot and just engaging with people in wonderful dialogue. But it really woke my eyes up. And the same conversation happened actually in Humboldt Park with a whole different population of people. So, you know, it was basically being in a totally different environment than I was used to, and doing it because of total naivete, but really eye-opening for me on what I've always been able to do, and you know, why should I? So that's my story.
Any impressions or questions or curiosities about that?
I'm curious if that caused you to be more aware of other people who were in those shoes, you know, whether they were your skin color or not, but they were the minority.
Yeah, I mean, I would probably say that was a beginning of thinking differently about things that I hadn't thought about. But I would say that took a. I'm in the middle age group too, so it took into other, you know, it takes a number of, you know, incidences to kind of beat it through a thick skull. So.
I'll go ahead and go.
Craig,
All
hold
right.
on 1 second.
Yep.
Hold on just 1 second. One of the things I want to point out from Tom's narrative is that this is an epiphany moment for Tom on his own continuum about race, and that it happens in a space where he is experiencing life counterculturally to what he experiences every day, right? This is oftentimes a demarcation point on a learning trajectory about race. And so here's the catch. We don't get to have it if we're not willing to immerse ourselves in a countercultural experience. Oftentimes people use mission trips and things like that to have that experience. Not my favorite way to go, but it is a way, right? I could say things about that as well. But when we are completely outside of what is normative for us, we perk up in our awareness of what is happening around us. We can then also see things we've not typically and traditionally seen before. And so the question Tom's narrative begs is, when are the moments in your life that you have had counter-cultural immersion, and what impact has it had on your life? And if you have not had those interactions, get curious with yourself about why not, and not just what you're protected from and not having them, but also what are you missing or losing as a result of not having counter-cultural immersive experiences. So I'm gonna put a pin in that, because our stories do welcome and invite us to get curious about our own lives in very unique and interesting ways. Craig.
So my story is not unlike Tom's, but a little different. As context, I grew up in a white suburb. It was outside of Detroit, but it was, I would say I don't remember any Black friends at all growing up. I went to school way up in northern Michigan. I graduated from there and went to work in all communities where I really had no interaction with these with issues of race in society. But I moved to I moved overseas. I was there for about 10 or 11 years. I came back and I adopted, in the process, my wife and I adopted some Chinese children because the Chinese culture was important to us. But at this point, I'm, 35 years old, give or take. And I'm playing golf one day with a gentleman. Well, I say that with a gentleman who probably I would have played with at any time. No different. I'm someplace. I think I was in Texas, and this person starts to go on and on and on about Chinese people and how terrible they are and how bad this is for the world and all the bad things about this culture. And I know very quickly that this person knows nothing about Chinese culture, and why he has these impressions, I don't remember. But it made me very, very angry, obviously, because I thought it's a great culture and I have 2 Chinese children and I'm worried about them and people like this. But what really hit me, what really left me from that conversation that stays with me now, not necessarily in a positive way sometimes, but it was positive at the time, was after that conversation, I looked at it and said, in the context of other race discussions, am I that guy? Right? Am I so ignorant of the situation around me because of the way I grew up that I'm that guy and I don't even realize it? And for me, that was a big turning point to try to understand this a little better. But on the flip side of that, that was great, but it's always made me worry in race conversations about, it's made me aware, but I always worry too much about, am I wrong? Am I actually, when I am actually not wrong? But, there are times when I'm ignorant and there's times when I have biases and I see that, but I haven't been able to find the balance. And actually ever since then, yet. So anyway, that's my conversation and story.
Any impressions or questions about Craig's story?
I just want to say I really appreciate when you told that story, how you switched your own viewpoint, deliberate perspective taking, right? You weren't just a person who was immediately offended by that comment, but you immediately put yourself, at least as you were describing it, right, as someone who was the producer of that comment. I think that's powerful for you to do. So thank you for doing that.
I think another thing that I would like to note is that when we have relationship that is personal and proximate, it often shifts our posture and the way that we show up and relate to other ways of being and other people who represent other ways of being. Which is to say that the inverse is also true. Oftentimes we fight for ideas, but when you ask if we know anybody who is proximate to this idea or issue of justice, we don't know any people who are tied to it. And that often negatively impacts the way in which we fight for the thing. So if we say Black Lives Matter, and we're always in these fights about which lives matter, if it's Black lives or blue lives or all lives or trans lives, right? And in my estimation, you know which lives matter by how much I expend myself towards the mattering of that life. So for example, in my life, you know my kids' lives matter because I ran in here halfway catching my breath to get into this workshop, but I had to go take my little one because they have new math workbooks at school, and she's a remote learner, and she had to have it today. And her life matters, and what matters to her matters to me. So I figured out a way to make it happen because her life matters. And so when I think about how I spend my time, and I think about women's lives, and I think about Black lives, and I think about poor lives, and I think about disabled lives, all of these lives are lives that I spend 13, 14, 15-hour days talking about the issues of. And also, I know people who are proximate to my life, who are Black and who are brown and who are disabled and who are part of the LGBTQIA community. And if they weren't in my life, then I don't know if it would be appropriate for me to only take up the issue, right? Because I could say Black Lives Matter and then come into the coffee shop and demand to speak to the owner of Live Cafe. And when I say you're talking to the owner of Live Cafe, I'm told that can't be. And I'm like, well, when you find her, give her all these bills because she should have them and not me, right? But to Dr. Pruitt Adams' point, that's just not possible. You can't be the owner. But I'll go back home to my house with my sign on my lawn about how Black lives matter, right? That's the disconnect between fighting for issues rather than fighting for people who are also interfacing and have experienced an oppression because of this issue. I know it ethereally, but I don't know the depth of tears associated with it. And so I can fight for it ethereally, but I can't really fight for it with the depth of tears that are associated with it. What Craig experienced on the golf course was the depth of relationship tied to an issue of injustice. Where if that tie was not there, he might have said, oh my gosh, this is inappropriate. I mean, my goodness, this is unacceptable. But that golf game might have gone right on because there's no proximity to the life that is so pervasively impacted by the issue. And so as we continue to hear stories, I will be raising up, and you all are the curriculum, friends. You are the curriculum. You've lived the curriculum. You embody the curriculum. And so as you tell your story, the curriculum will emerge, and that's what's happening. So we see the importance of being connected to a life, not just knowing an issue. Because I can know an issue, I could plug into an issue. Guess what? I can unplug from an issue too. But human beings are much harder to unplug from, especially ones you go deep and do life on life with. And now you have to be connected to something much more powerful and enduring and rich and vulnerable and tender than just the idea of injustice. That's the difference. Questions or concerns or comments, questions, anything about that? All right, I think we have time for one more.
I could share if nobody else is jumping in. You know, as soon as you asked this question, Rashida, I knew exactly what story I was going to go to. Exactly. And I was a little boy. I grew up in an all-white suburb. Well, almost all-white suburb. And I was in church as a little boy. So I was every Sunday I went to church, and it was all around white people, nothing but white people, of course. And this is probably now late 70s. I was so probably 5 or 6. I mean, I remember being very small because I can remember my stature against my parent that I was standing to. So we were standing outside church as we do after this service, and we're in a little foyer, and we're all talking. Basically, this was a little kid just looking up, watching adults talk. All right, that's pretty much how that worked. And as I was looking around at the adults, I saw a mixed race couple. I saw a black man with a white woman across the way. And it's the first time I'd ever seen that in this church, and probably at that point in my life that I can recall at this point that I ever seen a mixed race couple. And I remember reaching up, and I remember grabbing my father's elbow on his shirt and saying, "Dad, who is that?" And there was no response, as if he didn't hear me, but I knew he heard me. And immediately I had a hand on my shoulder. And when you got my dad's hand on your shoulder, that meant something. It hurt. And I was turned around. And my dad said something to the effect of, we don't talk about that, Craig. And we moved physically, like we went to a different space. And it's funny because you asked us to write down what this story was. And I got to this point in the story, and I kind of jotting down the bullets. And immediately what hit me was this, like I still feel it. I still feel it. Like there was this sense of confusion, and there was this sense of guilt. And it's not guilt that would come from later, like awareness to life or shame or anything like that, later in life thinking about race. It was guilt as a kid thinking that I had done something wrong. I had messed up, and I had no clue why I messed up. I remember, well, I don't think I've ever talked about that processed that with my parents. But it stayed with me, and I probably sat with that memory for the better part of a decade before I shared that out with anybody, I'm sure. So yeah, it was that overwhelming sense of guilt that simply saying that was wrong, right? Verbalizing that was wrong. So that's the story.
Thank you, Greg, for sharing that with us. Any questions, comments, impressions that anyone would like to share with Greg?
I have, it's interesting. Thank you, Greg, for sharing that. Such a young memory as well. And it reminds me a lot of the work of, there's an author, Shannon Sullivan, and she talks about how white children are not taught about race, as though that's better than, that's proof that you're not a racist. And that was such a perfect example of, we don't talk about that, but the message that you got, it seems like, was I did something wrong. And as opposed to if it had been a conversation, or we'll talk about it later, but it was physical too. It was that hand on your shoulder that was, saying this is wrong. And, I have the kind of the mirror experience of that. And I was young. I don't know how old I was, maybe about the same age. And I remember being out with my mom, and this baby or little boy, I can't, toddler or baby, was staring at me, like mouth open staring. And I was always like, hi baby, that kind of thing. And I had never seen anyone look at me like that before. And I just remember looking up at my mom and not asking a question, but just looking up at her like, what's going on? And she just said to me, he's never seen a Black person before. And the way that she said it had an edge to it. And it was like it was directed at this child's mother. And so I hadn't thought about that in years until you were just talking about that. And it was like, how is that possible that someone not just hasn't seen this before, you know, a Black person before, but the look was of such, you know, like, what is this? And so I think in both ways, it's that education. What do we do with that, you know, those kind of memories, and how do they affect us? So it's very powerful what you were talking about, because it was physical and words all together.
You know, if I could comment on Jackie's story, that I'm almost sure for every person of color in this room, the freeness of which your mother was able to say to you, Jackie, she's never seen a Black child, a Black person before. The lack of comfort Greg's dad felt was saying we don't talk about it. And we as people of color grow up with the talk. And you know, it's ingrained in us on how to walk, how to talk, how to act, how to receive people who haven't seen us. And just in hearing your two stories, which are similar, but so different in the way that your parents, the level of comfort of your parents in being able to address it.
And you know what, and that's the other thing, and Rashida, I thought about this too with this exercise, was that, you know, as a Black person, Black woman who was a little Black girl, it was hard to think about the first time, because it's, you know, it was like race was always something that was present, and being careful, and issues of racism as well. So like this first time thing, it was really, you know, it's like, well, I'll pick this one. That's how it felt, more than having to, it being a distinct memory. I guess that's what I'm trying to say.
And that's exactly what the exercise is designed to pull out, is the distinctives between the reality that some people had their first story as adults, right? And it was at least possible that some white people on the call in the workshop could have their first story as an adult. And that is just simply not possible at all in the life of a Black person. It's not possible, right? And I don't know that I would call that a privilege. I will call it an interesting distinctive, because the reason I can't call it a privilege is because I know what it was to be a Black girl growing up in the Austin community on the west side of Chicago. And I was having the time of my life because I could be with Black people all the time. And it was amazing, like Shalima, right? And I was also never of the mindset that I was somehow going to miss out on being with white people, because white people were around all the time. So I knew that I would have those interactions, right? And oftentimes when we talk about Black-white racism, Black-white existence in this country, we talk about how, oh, well, I didn't have that experience until later in life. And we talk about it as though it just is. But let's consider, what would life maybe have been like to have experienced the culture and existence of Blackness earlier in your lifetime, and consistently and pervasively. Like, we're not conditioned to think about not having that as an L. But because I had it, I know it's an L, right? It's an L. And so it's just kind of like, oh, well, I didn't have to think about it. But did you not have to think about it, or did you not get to think about it? And we're conditioned to think I didn't have to think about that. And then we think about it as privilege. But if you didn't get to experience it, it's not really a privilege. And so this is the conundrum that racial injustice creates for all of us. It creates the conundrum of, did I not have to, or did I not get to? Something was taken from me that I will now never know. I will never, ever really know if it was I didn't have to or I didn't get to. And that's what we hold as potentially an injustice in and of itself, that I never even got to choose a life of diverse intersectionality because of the way that we have carved up our country and our world. So as we get right up to 8, I told you, bell to bell, friends, with this teacher. Any final thoughts, just as we close out, what is sitting with you in your heart and your mind right now? No less than one word, no more than one sentence. Share what you will. Dina? Dina, you're not
Can't
muted.
hear you.
Oh, you can't hear me? I'm talking.
Now
Sorry.
we can.
I was thinking what you said is that our Black students don't get to have that experience. As a child who grew up in Oak Park, I did not get to have that experience, right? I had it in pockets. I didn't have it all the time running around just being thrilled to be Black and to be in a Black community. And our students don't get to have that experience. They are cognizant from kindergarten in Oak Park. So.
Thank you, Gina. Any other?
My observation is just going to be quick because I didn't tell my story, but my background is very different than anyone that gave out their background here. So I did grow up in a low income and multicultural environment. My high school, 300 white kids, 300 Black kids, 350 Latino kids, all poor. So what I'm hearing is the importance of the interpersonal relationship. Because when I first started really seeing overt racism was when I left poverty and got into wealth in the practice of law. And I was shocked by it, honestly, because my dad, who's passed away recently, but my dad, never did more than graduate high school, but he landed on D-Day, fought in the Battle of the Bulge, took Berlin under Patton. And he taught me to believe in America and what it stands for. And I always grew up fiercely patriotic, and seeing people of affluence who have had every advantage, not recognizing other people as their peers just because of their race, I found jarring and very anti-American. And it really made me question values.
Ralph, you bring up a really good point that they're going to be mad at me if I go into, and that's the idea of like all of this just about race, right? So I'm going to pick up there. You all don't let me forget. I'll do a debrief with LeVar. We're going to pick up at all of this just about race, right? And then the people who did not share their narratives, we're starting with narrative sharing in the next convening, which will be sometime, I think, in January.
Yes.
Thank you all so much for your engagement and your participation, the depth and the breadth of what you shared. We are only scratching the surface of the topic, but we are going deep in how we enter it. So hear that. And I am grateful for what you are embarking upon here. It means the world to me for lots of reasons. I'll share my story at another time. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Rashida. We are grateful for you. And setting the tone for us for this conversation. So we are grateful for that.
Thank you so much. Have a good evening, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Is there a motion?
Motion to adjourn. There you go. So moved.
Sorry. Is there a second?
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? All right. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you.
Have a good night.
Good night.
Good night.